One wrong bullet could have turned that mine into a dad-blasted tomb. I freely admit that my plan of attack was not just moronic, but clearly insane.
There's something about Call of Juarez Gunslinger's 4-hour campaign that keeps me coming back to it. It's the fourth and possibly final game in the series, and stands apart from its predecessors with a different style, tone, and no story connection. It's a comic book-like arcade-style action game set in the Wild West, complete with outlaws, Injuns, dynamite, and dual-wielding revolvers. I keep coming back to it because it's the perfect game for when I just want to feel like a one-man army. Everything about Gunslinger's gameplay screams indulgence. Points explode out of your enemies' bodies when you shoot them, the game patting you on the back at each click of the mouse, the corpse falling back in slow motion while you continue at full speed, because you're faster than all these sumbitches. Your concentration meter fills up rapidly with each kill and can be used over and over again to slow down time so you can chain headshots and dodge bullets. What's that? One of those bastards' bullets got through anyway. Well, your sense of death ability allows you to dodge it and kill the guy who dared to try. There are all kinds of passive upgrades you can unlock, which will boost your damage, extend your concentration, lower your recoil, etc. Get enough of the upgrades in one of the 3 trees, and you'll unlock more powerful versions of your weaponry. You can always change to a higher difficulty if you want to feel a little less invincible. Not that there's a huge difference between them. True West, the hardest of the 3, removes all of the HUD elements, so you can't keep track of your ammo, and you don't have a crosshair, which adds a little something extra, but you also don't get to see all those sweet points stacking up, and you do miss seeing that when you're playing it. The game is designed to make you feel like a badass, but more than that, it makes you feel like a cowboy. Not a boring, real-life cattle-herding cowboy, you're a fucking film cowboy. You've got the hat, you've got the drawl, and you're the fastest gun in the West. I mean, literally.
As fast as he was, I was just a bit faster.
Because, you see, there's more to it than just fun gunplay. Gunplay alone doesn't make you feel like a cowboy, but you're playing famed bounty hunter Silas Greaves, who just so happens to have come into direct contact with almost every legend the Wild West ever had. Billy the Kid, the Daltons, Johnny Ringo, Jesse James, the list goes on, and Silas, unmentioned by the history books, is responsible for many of their deaths. It's ridiculous, and that's what makes it so fun. There is an overarching story, but it takes a back seat and does a better job serving as the motivation for why Silas comes into contact with so many of these famous criminals. Even so, it's not really trying to come up with a compelling reason, it's just trying to fit in as many famous names as possible because that's what we love about the mythos of the Wild West. It's so overblown and unrealistic that I have no problem just enjoying it and buying into the idea that Silas really was so good that he faced down gun after gun and lived to tell the tale. And what a tale it is! So incredible that the patrons of the saloon Silas is visiting are willing to buy him drinks in exchange for just some of his stories. So, Silas sits and tells his stories, and you play through them. But sometimes the details aren't always quite right. At one point, suddenly a bunch of Native Americans surround him in a swamp despite there being no mention of them before.
Indians surrounded me from all sides. Indians? Or Indians? No. I just wanted to make sure Steve was paying attention. Now, where was I?
Another time, Silas gets interrupted and we see one of the coolest intro cards in a game full of slick, comic book style intros. Turns out, the Pinkertons aren't even in the game, but they still got an intro because the game commits to the unreliable narration. It's full of it. In fact, It might even overcommit, particularly its use of seemingly trapping Silas in an area before he says, "Suddenly, I noticed an exit I hadn't seen before," and the scenery shifts. But still, I appreciate the commitment. It adds another layer to this feeling of being in a hyperbolic yarn, an exaggerated version of what actually happened. Along with its cell shading and this border around the edges that frames the action, it gives it style. If they didn't commit to the storytelling element, if they'd gone for a grittier look, or toned down the unreliable aspects of the narration, then a lot of this stuff wouldn't work. It's why a steamboat can appear in a swamp before your eyes, you zoom into it, and when you zoom back out, you're in a different place, as if Silas suddenly remembered that he approached the boat from a different angle. And it doesn't feel cheap or tacky. And for those fans of this particular technique, there's a reference to another game famed for its dynamic narrator.
Well, it was a touching reunion.
The plot, much like the narration, does admittedly towards the end become so ridiculous that it gets a little jarring, even despite the events that precede it. You send a shack over a cliff with a man inside it, and the man climbs back up. In the final level you fight... I'm trying to avoid spoiling too much, so this is going to sound a little weird. You fight ghosts, and then at the climax you end up in a duel, the premise of which is so flimsy it's evident that the developers were just trying to fit in one last classic Wild West reference. But hey, if you start by telling a silly story, the only thing you can do is escalate. And then, if you keep an eye out, you'll find secrets in each level called Nuggets of Truth. Little cards giving the facts on famous events and people. There's a fantastic contrast when reading these. A reminder while you're playing through a hyper-unrealistic depiction of a period in time that is already regularly misrepresented. That, in real life, the outlaws of the Wild West tended to be thugs and murderers. And the supposed good guys often weren't all that much better. Did you ever play Cowboys on the playground when you were a kid? If you want something to get really immersed in, a game with a deep story and a world you can get lost in, then play the Red Deads. Gunslinger isn't those things, but it might be the closest you can come to reliving the simple joy of those pretend gunfights. At 4 hours, it's just short enough that the premise and its gimmicks don't wear on you even on subsequent playthroughs. Sometimes you don't feel like paying too much attention. Sometimes you want a break from deep stories or time sinks. Sometimes you just want to feel like a fucking cowboy.
There's a time for grieving, there's a time to just pray. There's a time for forgiving, but it's not for today. There's a time for grieving, there's a time to just pray. When solace returns you, it's a time you must pay.